Let's do an experiment. Let's say I have 40 M&Ms and spread it out amongst 10 kids. Some kids were given 15, others only 1. The rest belonged to me. I asked them, was it fair? What do you think their response would be? Were they mad or were they happy? Many of you might think it is obvious that they would be mad. I mean, look at the kid with only one candy. Who wants to have only one candy? Who? But actually, it was more like a mixture, both happy and sad. Two different perspectives. One with the 15 candies was found to be more pleased and happy than the one with only one candy. But the other few were disappointed, finding that the distribution was unfair and inconsistent. Then I asked them how we might distribute the candies for it to be fair. All of them agreed that all should have an equal amount of candies for everyone to enjoy. From the experiment, a conclusion can be produced. Fairness means equality. Now, equality is another good word to use in this situation, where the state of being fair and equal is being performed by the kids who redistribute the candies thinking it will be fair for all of them. But how about me? I didn't give out the candies equally, then what do you refer my action to be? That is called inequality. You're probably wondering, why are we learning about equality and inequality, and why do they matter? Well, it is because you can see them every day, on the news, on the paper, or even just by pure observation. We can see inequality and equality widely spread among our societies and communities. For instance, let's take China as a demonstration. In China, a very common inequality that appears frequently in the economic sector is the income inequality. Now, income inequality basically means the distribution of income is unevenly spread among the population. In other words, income inequality is the income gap between the rich and everybody else. Interestingly, income inequality doesn't just happen naturally in the public, but has something to do with the government and the people in China. While the government sticks with the ideology of being a communist and encourages the idea of equal wealth, the Chinese people takes a different turn and support capitalism to gain more profit by constructing their own industry and business. As a result, this has led China into great development in economy, gaining 10% in economic growth and is the world's biggest economy in 2014 according to the International Monetary Fund organization. However, despite having such great influence on the country, this development triggers a domino effect on the income scale in China. While capitalism continued to escalate, the rich became richer and the poor became poorer at an alarming rate, thus making the income gap between the rich and the poor so much larger than they already are. The poor ended up gaining a lower income than the rich does. As seen by this graph, 20% of the rich income continued to grow over the year from the year 1985 to 2012, but for the 20% of the poor, not much have changed, thus forming inequality in income for the people in China. As a matter of fact, income inequality has become such a severe condition that in China right now, 1/3 of the country's wealth is owned by 1% of the Chinese population and is home to 596 billionaires, more than those in the US, according to Huron 2015 China Rich List. So as you can see, just by following the ideology of capitalism, such benefits and inequality have brought upon China. Imagine what would happen if China followed communism instead of capitalism. As a prediction, such development wouldn't have flourished as much compared to capitalism. By making China communist, income would have been more distributed, supporting the poor much more than the rich. As a result, equality will be in much better shape, thus removing any potential inequality in China. And that's an example of how economic ideology affects the country's wealth. Talking about the income inequality, this somewhat reminds me of the wealth inequality. Due to the fact that income is what mainly generates the wealth of a person's asset, if neither income or wealth is affected, the others will also take effects as well. So it's important to look at how wealth is distributed amongst the people, just like how income is distributed, and see how it can affect the wealth gap and equality. According to the OECD in 2012, the top 0.6% of the world population, or the 45 million richest people in the world, owns a total of 39.6% of the world wealth, while the other bottom 95% held only 28% of the world wealth. Such unequal wealth distributed includes the values of home, automobiles, personal valuables, businesses, savings, and investment among the people. That's how critical the issue is, and it may escalate even further over the course of the years. The gap between the rich and the poor will continue to grow wider and wider until it is impossible to recover the wealth gap. However, it is not entirely impossible now to resolve the situation. There are multiple of solutions to escape the crisis and fix the inequality, and those solutions include progressive tax and universal basic income. Firstly, progressive tax is a tax that takes a higher percentage from higher incomers than it does from low incomers. In other words, tax will essentially be higher for the person that has a higher income, and tax will be lower for the person with a smaller income. For example, if a person who has an income of $3,000 a month, then the tax rate for him or her will be only 10%. But for a person that receives $100 a month, then the tax rate will immensely increase to 22%. By using this method to chart taxes, low incomers would have lower tax burdens, which mean they can afford to pay tax that fit within their income range and also leave more money in their pockets to contribute to the economy. But also at the same time, progressive tax raise more taxes than any other taxing method because the tax rates increase as income of a person rises, therefore accumulating greater amounts of taxes from the people with the greatest amount of resources, which help the government to build infrastructure, roads, schools, etc. Many politicians and economists will consider progressive tax to be a very effective tool to shrink the poor and the rich wealth gap, because essentially it tax less for the poor, therefore giving the poor more money to keep in order to catch up with the rich wealth, while taxing the rich higher to avoid the rich income from skyrocketing, but also contributing the money to the government and shrink the gap of inequality. However, many critics of progressive tax complain that the tax system might be discriminatory against higher income earners or wealthy people, saying that there is no reason for them to be paying a higher tax than the poor, and it isn't fair for them to be the only one paying the most of the country's wealth by paying taxes, which created controversy in whether progressive tax is effective in solving the wealth inequality or not, because progressive tax to the poor is very efficient, but progressive tax to the rich is unfair. The other solution is by performing the universal basic income method. The universal basic income basically is a model in providing the people with a fixed sum of money regardless of their resources, employment status, or income, with the purpose of preventing and reduce poverty in the country and strengthen equality amongst all residents. So no matter who you are or how wealthy you are, if you're a resident in the country that have universal basic income employed, then a sum of money will be given to you to support your condition. By receiving this sum of money, the poor will be able to use the money to improve the quality of their life and not struggling with the lack of resources. Also, because everyone is giving with the same amount of money, equality should be much more supportive for both the poor and the rich, because the poor wealth will soon catch up with the rich wealth, forcing the gap between the poor and the rich wealth inequality to narrow itself. Many of the citizens would have agreed to the solution because financial support is really essential, and that's what lacking to balancing out the wealth inequality between the poor and the rich. Not just only balancing out the wealth inequality through the view of an economist, if more people begin to acquire more money from the universal basic income, then the economy of the country will be in a boom time, because universal basic income is what motivates the people or the consumer in spending money on the economy of the country. However, universal basic income might felt like an advantage to everyone, the rich, the poor, but not so much for the government. Universal basic income comes with a price, and it's not cheap. The price usually depends on the number of residents in the country. The higher the number of residents, the higher the universal basic income is going to be. So, if the country has a high number of residents, then the accumulation of financial support will also need to be high, therefore making it very difficult for the government to gather this huge amount of money to employ the universal basic income solution. From these two solutions, limitations and benefits do come along and balance out each other. But for one of my solutions that stands out the most is progressive tax. The reason that I choose progressive tax is because progressive tax seems to be easier to start and achievable than the universal basic income. Even though both solutions have the ability to resolve the wealth inequality, progressive tax is easy for poor countries to start off because the system itself doesn't have a cost like the one in the universal basic income, which make universal basic income impossible for poor countries to follow. Also, progressive tax help the government to cultivate much more taxes, which can be used for developing the country and building up more services for the people living there. Lastly, it affects the wealth inequality and economy as well. Progressive tax doesn't just help the poor people in paying tax, but they also help the poor to catch up with the rich wealth. By paying less tax, the poor can save up more money, thus giving them the opportunity to build up their own business and cultivate their own profits from there. It's only a matter of time when the wealth gap becomes smaller and smaller, thus slowly resolving the inequality between the poor and the rich.